Well, good morning, and here we are on the 30th of January, which corresponds, I think, to the dog days of the year, really. We've been there for a while, just another 2 days, and then we're into the new year. But only nominally, because the new year would be 2 months later, I think, in terms of the normal progression of the seasons and the months. The new year would start on the 1st of March, as I understand it. But nonetheless, it will be 2025 in the world in a couple of days' time. And this is a period that I think I'm probably not the only one suffering from a measure of despondency or gloomy thoughts, even depression, I suppose. It's been a while now, and like a lot of people, I live alone and have no contact really with anybody else, or very few people. It's one of the issues of following Christ, I think, also, because one of the reasons that I find it difficult to sort of join any kind of confederacy or to assemble a group of friends is because I'm always the only one of them that's a believer, and it irks me sometimes. Also, people who have no belief in God or a weak belief in God necessarily have to view me and my ilk, those of us who truly do kneel before the cross, as it were. We are convinced of the authority of Scripture and the authority in particular, of course, of Jesus Christ. To people from the humanist persuasion or from those who follow the gods of nature or the gods that they invent in their minds, I think Christians, particularly for the humanists, as a believer, they would have to view me as being somebody with a kind of a mental disability or a mental aberration, because I believe in the authenticity of something that I've created in my own mind. I think that's the only way that they could explain me and believe us, that we are somehow deluded, I guess. And that makes for, of course you don't have to talk about that all the time, but it is a baseline, and it's quite a sobering thought, really. And in the latter period, as I've gone through various adjustments to my regime or regimen or health and exercise and all sorts of things, and I'd stopped smoking completely and stopped taking any form of tobacco, and I decided to reverse that choice about a week ago. I had about 4 weeks of abstinence, but I missed the pipe smoking, and I began to research the benefits of nicotine in particular. And so I decided to resume my pipe smoking activity, and it just gives me a little bit more social contact, and that's the thing that I particularly missed. As a pipe smoker, I find I can go anywhere really and sit and smoke my pipe, and there's a fair chance that I will be able to chat to somebody, because it's an unusual thing. It's a slightly extroverted thing to do, I suppose, and unusual at the moment. People have abandoned the pipe greatly. That's one of the things that I particularly missed, because when I go to the pub or something for a meal, if all I'm having is some food and a cup of coffee, I don't really get a chance to chat. Now, I'm interested in addictions, and I've been studying my own addiction, and as somebody who goes to the pub quite regularly, of course it doesn't escape my attention that everybody that goes there, more or less, is drinking alcohol. And sometimes they start drinking alcohol at 8 o'clock in the morning. If I go to the pub early, there will be 3 or 4 men who will come in and have a pint and then stay there for quite a while and maybe have 2 or 3. But in the evening, 2 or 3 or 4 pints is quite a normal consumption. Perhaps not if you're driving, but a couple of pints at least. And a couple of pints of alcohol, of beer, has quite an effect on the mind and the body. It's quite a lot of sugar and carbohydrates and stuff like that. And it affects the mind also, of course. Not necessarily in an unpleasant way. The thing with addictions, if you were to do it once or twice, I'm sure it would be fine. But many people do it as just part of the standard British lifestyle. And that creates a sense of camaraderie, I think, in the pub, those who are drinking, somewhat doing the same thing. So me sitting in a corner, perhaps reading the Bible and just drinking coffee and having bacon and eggs or whatever I can get hold of. It makes me feel, I suppose, appear that I'm not part of the general flow of things, whereas smoking a pipe seems to overcome that. So that's been my decision. I think I could do without the nicotine, generally speaking, but I'm not sure that nicotine really does have some perhaps beneficial effects. Once I discovered that there are nicotine receptors in the brain, and then began to share with what's his name now, a gentleman that I've been following on YouTube, the idea that perhaps tobacco smoking has been unfairly criticised and claimed to be the cause of all sorts of illnesses. But men have smoked tobacco and have smoked pipes for hundreds of years. And we also know that illnesses are caused very often by incorrect nutrition, lack of exercise, medical procedures, medicines that people take. Whereas smoking may have some protective effects. I don't know exactly. But I think of all the smokings, the pipe is probably the best one because there's less inhalation or no inhalation, perhaps if you do it correctly. I think I inhale a little bit, but it's not like smoking cigarettes. It's a different sensation. So I'm resuming my addictive behaviours, but many people are addicted without really questioning, and they're addicted to alcohol in the main. And then all the networks of relationships that exist, which I'm outside of, because really I have no family to refer to. I have my sister and I have my daughter, but they're both far away. And I don't really have any much regular conversation with them, and my sister and my daughter both are from the humanist camp, so I would fall into the mental aberration category for them, I suppose. But as I have been experiencing this low mood, or a sense of hopelessness, actually, it's come to my mind that perhaps there's a measure of catharsis and disintoxication that occurs also in the emotional realm. So, as the body begins to clear and as we focus on trying to move forward in our life, whatever we're doing, then, it's not unusual for past trauma to come up and present roadblocks and obstacles to our tranquility, because you're flushing these things out of the mind also, not just the body. And one of the things that I've become a little bit bogged down by lately is a resurgence of my dependence on a limerent relationship that I developed with with a practicing witch, actually. And limerent relationships are notoriously hard to dispel. And I think the reason is that that a limerent relationship is just an imagined relationship. A man or a woman has been somehow persuaded that they have a relationship with a person, but they don't actually have a relationship. You could say that deception has been involved, or it could be just, how would you call it? Presumption. This would be the case of an obsession. I had a friend in Italy who was constantly, this was a young lady, the wife of a friend actually, and she suffered from limerent relationships with well-known musicians, and started to write to them and then to various different people that she would meet in her life. And she developed romantic ties to these people and started to write letters and all sorts of things, but she didn't really know them at all. And she got herself into some quite deep water, actually. She was an attractive lady, and her husband was a very jealous man. And the last limerent relationship that I heard about was with me, to my surprise. And this gentleman that I used to know quite well threatened me and my family over it, although there was no substance to the relationship at all. I would never mess around with my friend's wife. But he was a jealous man. I think he knew that there was nothing in it because he knew his wife, but nonetheless, he was piqued, and he behaved really quite poorly because he threatened my wife and my daughter primarily. Although perhaps it was with my wife that he had the issue, because she had, I think, threatened to expose his unjust treatment of his own wife. There seemed to be some bullying and perhaps some physical violence occurring. This was a very vulnerable woman, I suppose, and very much in her mind and in her fantasy world. And her husband was a very hard-nosed man indeed, and somebody who had boasted of having mafia affiliations, and perhaps he had. He was certainly from the right part of the world to have them. Camorra rather than mafia, so we're speaking Naples. Not people to be messing with. Well, I don't like to mess with anybody, really. So my own limerent relationship with the witch, because I saw the person fairly recently for the first time for almost a year. Um, I think it was because I'd seen her. I imagined that if I were to see her again, we would have a conversation and speak about what had happened, but nothing had happened for her, so it's rather I'm persuaded that perhaps it's best not to speak at all. And it brought it home to me once again how much I was disappointed. And this is something that harkens back to my relationship with my mother, I think. Um, I'd become very dependent on women in general. And I had that kind of relationship with my wife also, sort of a mothering relationship, which I only managed to extricate myself from after the blow of the witch when she rejected my advances. And I saw the situation, I think, a bit more objectively. So it's difficult to recover from something that doesn't really exist, as it were. It was just a fantasy in my mind, and a fantasy which had been very carefully, I would say, enabled. Um, I was led down deceptive paths, and I was a willing follower, but nonetheless, a certain amount of misdirection had been practiced. There's no question of it. So those feelings are coming up, and you just have to, I think you have to just ride with them and process them. I think that's what's going to have to happen. Um, Speaking about it, I think, will be helpful. My sister was quite surprised when I said that I was still somewhat upset by the whole thing. She said, "Well, you should be over it by now." It was 2 years ago, I think, something like that. But the only way to get over something like that, if it's a real relationship and you're let down, then the only way to get over that, really, I suppose, is to have another relationship with somebody else who doesn't let you down. That seems to work. I remember when my girlfriend left me when I was only a young lad. I would have been 16 or 17, 16 perhaps. No, less, 15. And we moved from the country into town, and she took up with some other fellow, and I was living in a completely new town, and I didn't know anybody. And that was it was a very difficult time. I was very upset, and it lasted for quite a long time. And eventually I met another woman, and that was the thing that sort of tided me over, really. I met my first real girlfriend, and so we were together for about 4 years. She was a very nice girl. But at my time in life, I don't think there's much chance of me meeting um, a replacement, and so I have to process the basic attachment, which is related to my upbringing, and I think maybe an inappropriate relationship with my mother. Mothers have to be careful with their male offspring, not to intrude in certain areas, but without my father to give guidance and direction to both of us, really, the thing couldn't be achieved. I think there's quite a lot of men that have been brought up by their mothers these days, perhaps more and more. It's a common thing. But lads need to be brought up by a dad who's going to be present and give instruction. My father gave me some instruction, but he was completely innocent in the realm of philosophy and relations with women. He had no real advice to offer. He didn't understand it himself. So there, could it be that our detoxification process also affects the emotional realm? And as we begin to free ourselves from these shadowy ghosts of the past that hold us in a form of bondage, I suppose, really. That's my question. If anybody wants to chime in, I'd be very interested to read what you might care to write, if anybody does indeed listen. God bless.